Hello?
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello?
Is this Mrs. Dorothy Letterman?
That's right, Dorothy.
Yes, it is. Who's this?
Are you the mother of David Letterman who does Late Night on NBC?
There is a particular kind of man who builds an empire not through aggression, but through the slow, meticulous accumulation of trust, and then protects that empire with a silence so complete, so perfectly calibrated, that the very absence of his approval becomes more feared than any open act of punishment could ever be. Johnny Carson spent 30 years doing exactly that. From the moment he took command of The Tonight Show in October 1962 to the evening in May 1992, when he quietly said good night for the final time, he constructed something that had never existed before and has never been successfully replicated since, a single platform so dominant, so concentrated in its cultural authority, that the trajectory of an entire industry bent around his judgment the way light bends around a gravitational mass. He could watch a comedian for 5 minutes on live television and decide, in the most public way imaginable, that this person deserved to exist at the highest level of American entertainment. And he could decide the opposite just as permanently, just as quietly, with nothing more than an unreturned phone call and a booking that never came. What makes Carson worth studying today is not merely the scale of that power, it is what he chose to do with it when he felt it had been disrespected, and what those choices reveal about the architecture of a man that even his closest admirers never fully managed to see. To grasp why a single gesture from Carson could remake a career overnight, you have to understand the media landscape he operated within, a world that bears almost no resemblance to the fragmented, algorithm-driven ecosystem that exists today. In the 1960s, 1970s, and through most of the 1980s, there were 3 major television networks, a handful of viable late-night time slots, and one program that existed on an entirely different plane from every other option available. The Tonight Show, which regularly drew audiences exceeding 30 million viewers on a single broadcast. There was no path around it. A comedian could spend a decade grinding through club circuits, city after city, earning loyalty one room at a time, and none of that accumulated work could substitute for what 5 minutes on Carson's stage could deliver in a single evening. The famous Carson wave, that understated, almost imperceptible gesture inviting a performer to cross from the performance space to the interview chair, was the most coveted signal in American show business, not because it indicated that a performer had been good, but because it indicated that Carson had decided they were worth trusting with 30 million people's continued attention. Jerry Seinfeld earned that wave. David Letterman earned it. Ellen DeGeneres walked onto that stage as a promising stand-up and walked off as someone whose career had permanently changed direction, the trajectory altered not by her own effort alone but by the public, unambiguous endorsement of the one man in the country whose opinion on such matters carried the force of institutional decree. What made Carson genuinely extraordinary, however, and what the entertainment industry never quite got used to, no matter how many times it witnessed the mechanism at work, was the fact that the same power operated with equal precision in the opposite direction. Every gift he had for launching careers, he possessed in equal measure for quietly terminating them. Joan Rivers understood both sides of that equation more completely than anyone else who ever occupied the chair across from Carson's desk, and her story, which spans nearly 4 decades, begins with one of the most generous acts of professional sponsorship in late-night history, and ends with a silence that lasted until Carson's death, is the most complete and emotionally honest portrait we have of what it actually meant to operate within his world and then be excluded from it. When Carson first brought her onto The Tonight Show in the early 1960s, she was 31 years old and had already absorbed years of rejection from an industry that remained deeply uncomfortable with female comedians who refused to flatten themselves into acceptable shapes. Carson looked past every one of those objections. He saw velocity, precision, and an appetite for the room that couldn't be manufactured or learned. It either lived in you or it didn't, and he backed that instinct with the full weight of his platform. After her first appearance, he looked directly into the camera and told America she was going to be a star. Those words were not promotional language. In the context of what Carson's endorsement meant, they were something considerably more binding than that. He made her a regular guest. He eventually installed her as a permanent guest host when he took nights off, a degree of trust that was, by the standards of that era, genuinely without precedent for a female comedian. For more than 2 decades, the arrangement functioned because both parties understood their respective roles with perfect clarity. Then in 1986, Fox offered Rivers her own late-night program, the first woman to anchor a major network late-night show, an opportunity that no rational person could have declined. She had already learned through NBC insiders that she was not being considered as Carson's successor. She accepted Fox's offer. She did not tell Carson first. He heard about it from someone else. That sequence of information, not the decision itself, but who told him and when, ended 30 years of warmth and professional loyalty in a single afternoon. He hung up the phone. He never responded to another letter she sent. He removed her appearances from the show's archival record with a thoroughness that spoke not merely of professional betrayal but of something considerably more personal, a specific, irreversible grief that had curdled into institutional policy. She wrote to him every year until he died. She said publicly and without reservation that she would have done anything to repair it. And she said something else that cuts to the center of Carson's character with a precision that even his most devoted admirers found difficult to dismiss. She believed he had assumed, because she was a woman, that the rules of ambition he had extended to every male performer he championed simply didn't apply to her. When he died in January 2005, Rivers wept, not for a cultural institution she had admired, but for the mentor who had believed in her before anyone else had, and who chose, in the end, to let silence be his permanent reply to everything she ever sent him. The pattern extended well beyond Rivers, and several of the other cases reveal something even more unsettling about the logic underlying Carson's authority, because they demonstrate that the threshold for crossing him was far lower than the magnitude of the exile that followed would ever suggest. Rich Little was among the most technically gifted impressionists of his generation, and a reliable Tonight Show presence precisely because his material made the host's job easier rather than harder. The complication arrived when Little's impression of Carson himself appeared once too often in the host's company. There was no confrontation, no visible anger, no formal communication of any kind, only an explanation, offered to booking staff, that Little's material had grown repetitive. Everyone in the industry understood that translation immediately. Dana Carvey encountered the same wall from an entirely different angle. His Carson impression was precise, affectionate, the kind of tribute that a younger performer offers a figure who shaped his entire understanding of what late-night television could be, and he deployed it during a casual promotional appearance in exactly that spirit, good-natured and openly admiring. Carson did not receive it as flattery. He received it as presumption. The phone stopped ringing. What makes both cases particularly revealing is that neither man did anything a reasonable observer would classify as a genuine offense. They were comedians doing what comedians do, drawing material from the people they most respected. But Carson operated according to a framework in which admiration and authorization were categorically different currencies, and spending one without the other was a transaction he considered fraudulent regardless of intent. Howie Mandel's banishment arrived through a prop, a large stuffed tiger brought on stage without producer clearance, disrupting the show's rhythm in ways that Carson absorbed behind a perfectly maintained professional smile and never forgave. No explanation was offered. No path back was indicated. And Lola Falana's exclusion carries a heavier weight than any of these, because it speaks not merely to Carson's personal grievances, but to the hard limits of even the most powerful platform when the man controlling it has decided, consciously or not, what kinds of truths his audience is permitted to hear. She appeared on The Tonight Show, spoke with honesty and specificity about what it meant to be a black woman navigating the entertainment industry, and was never invited back. The conversation she started did not continue. That particular silence is not about loyalty withdrawn. It is about authority being used to determine which experiences deserve to be heard and which could simply be allowed to disappear. Wayne Newton's confrontation with Carson takes the most openly dramatic shape of any of these falling outs, and perhaps because of that directness, it tends to be remembered with something closer to reluctant admiration than the others. The two men had coexisted as approximate industry peers for years, different domains, different audiences, but a shared fluency in old-school showmanship that made for easy, mutually enjoyable television. The rupture began when Newton outbid Carson for partial ownership of the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. From Newton's perspective, it was a straightforward business decision with no personal dimension whatsoever. From Carson's perspective, it was a colleague walking directly into his territory without acknowledgement, without the basic deference that their relationship had long since established. His response took the form of a sustained monologue campaign that began as playful needling and escalated, over weeks, into something that felt distinctly more systematic. Jokes that questioned Newton's masculinity, that reached into his personal life, delivered with a timing that made anything Carson said land in front of a studio audience. Newton absorbed it as long as he could, attempted to ignore it, tried to laugh it off in interviews, and eventually reached the conclusion that he was done. He walked into NBC studios without an appointment, without representation, without a camera in sight, and he found Carson backstage. Whatever was said in that conversation, accounts have always varied, the outcome was immediate and absolute. The joke stopped. The friendship ended. The invitations ceased. It was, in its strange and almost archaic way, the most honest transaction in this entire chronicle. A man who had been diminished publicly decided he was worth more than the treatment he was receiving, walked directly to the only person whose position on the matter could change anything, said what he needed to say, and accepted the permanent consequences without complaint. No more jokes. No more humiliation. But also no restoration, no reconciliation, no path back. In a landscape where virtually every other target of Carson's withdrawal absorbed their exile and silence, Newton's decision to confront it directly stands as the singular exception, and perhaps the only response that Carson, on some fundamental level, was constitutionally built to respect, even as he ensured it would not be rewarded. What Carson's private life reveals about the man behind the desk is, in many ways, the most difficult part of his story to hold clearly, because it demands a reconciliation between the extraordinary warmth he could generate on camera and a deep, almost architecturally fundamental difficulty sustaining genuine intimacy away from it. He was married 4 times. His first marriage, to Jody Walcott, had begun before fame arrived and couldn't survive what fame did to the person she thought she had married. The marriages that followed traced a pattern of glamour giving way to collapse, of proximity revealing distances that no amount of public charm could bridge in private. By the time he married Alexis Moss in 1987, something had genuinely shifted, whether through the accumulation of loss or the specific self-knowledge that only arrives after enough damage to make pretending pointless. The final chapter of his personal life was quieter, more private, and in many ways more honest than anything that had come before. The death of his son Rick in 1991, killed in a car accident, in circumstances shadowed by instability that had complicated Rick's entire adult life, fractured something in Carson that no professional performance, however immaculate, could fully conceal. He was devastated in a way he had no available vocabulary for on television, and the attempt to find that vocabulary in front of an audience was one of the most genuinely unguarded things his viewers ever saw from him, not the crafted warmth of the host, but the raw, undisguised grief of a father who had not managed to close the distance between himself and his son before the distance became permanent. When he retired in May 1992 with a broadcast that reduced his audience to tears, he disappeared with a completeness that precisely mirrored the silence he had imposed on everyone he had ever banned. He moved to Malibu. He refused every interview, every retrospective, every invitation to revisit and contextualize what he had spent 30 years building. He became, in the end, the unreachable figure that all those exiled performers had spent years trying to reach, someone whose approval still mattered enormously, whose silence remained deafening, who had made peace entirely on his own terms with the distance that had always existed between himself and virtually everyone else. Johnny Carson died in January 2005, and the tributes that arrived from every corner of the entertainment world carried within them something more layered than simple grief, an unresolved mixture of genuine loss and the particular ache of having spent years attempting to truly know someone who had decided, long before any of them had reached him, that being known was a vulnerability he could not afford. His cultural legacy is so total that it has become largely invisible in the way that only the most foundational structures eventually become invisible. You stop registering the architecture because you have lived inside it your entire life. The late-night opening monologue as nightly cultural thermometer. The desk segment as pressure release. The guest interview as the sophisticated art of making careful performance look like spontaneous conversation. Every late-night host working anywhere in the world today is operating inside a framework that Carson built and refined across 3 decades of 5-nights-a-week television, a framework so durable and so deeply embedded in the medium that none of his successors have felt any need to fundamentally reimagine it. What none of them have replicated, and what the current media landscape may make structurally impossible to ever recreate, is the specific, concentrated authority that made his approval worth so much and his silence so consequential. In a world of 3 networks and 1 dominant platform, a single man genuinely could alter the direction of a career with nothing more than a gesture or an absence, a wave of the hand or a failure to pick up the telephone. That era is gone. Its passing has made careers both more resilient and somehow less electric, harder to destroy completely, but also harder to launch with the kind of singular, lightning-bolt certainty that came from one man deciding, in 5 minutes of live television, that you were someone worth believing in. Joan Rivers knew what that certainty felt like. She knew the wave and the chair and the camera turning toward her. And she knew the silence that followed, the silence that lasted 19 years and met every letter she wrote and told her, in the end, more about the man who sent it than any interview he never gave. In the space between the wave that made her a star and the silence that defined the remainder of his life lives the fullest and most honest portrait of who Johnny Carson really was. A man of extraordinary gifts, genuine generosity, and a capacity for loyalty that was, at its very foundation, inseparable from a capacity for its permanent, absolute withdrawal.